Okay, so I think all of our students have now had to move on, so unfortunately our theme of wilderness seeking the future when the future just left the room is not great, but we'll try. It's going to be recorded, Gary tells me anyway. So again, the title of our last panel, Wilderness Seeking the Future. We have 4 speakers. I know many of you know them all. Sally Ferguson, the Executive Director of the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church Foundation. She has been with SCA in the past, and she's a founding president of the Idaho Trails Association. John McCarthy, former reporter, the Lewiston Trib, conservation advocate, Idaho Conservation League, and the Wilderness Society. Now he plays some good jazz on Idaho radio, right? Public radio, if you've heard him. Radio Boise. Craig Yerke, who we all know from earlier today, and Rick Johnson, same. What I want to do is let John and then Sally speak a little longer, because they were both in Albuquerque last week and have some thoughts, insights, observations, and maybe prompts for all of us about what they didn't hear or what alarmed them or what ought to be done next. And then we'll follow that with Craig and Rick, and then open it up and try to make it as open and collaborative as we can, because we're talking about the future here. And I know who's out there. A lot of people have good observations to make, so we'll try to make it as collaborative as possible, and then that'll be it till tonight for those of you who are going for the honor of seeing cease. Okay, so John.
Well, with this crowd, there's going to be a slight change up in the little spiel I give here, but I'm going to do a rah-rah. The thing in Albuquerque, the 50th anniversary of the National Wilderness Conference, the history was really interesting, the science was really interesting. Anything that related to current politics of life was really conflicted. Not always, but a lot. But I just came away with the sense that our greatest thing about wilderness is that wilderness is doing great. Wilderness is about magic, wonder, adventure, and that's always going to be there for us. When us kinds of environmentalists get together, we talk about such fun things as extinction and invasive species and fights with everybody and all kinds of how Congress is miserable and all this kind of fun stuff. And then you look at the world, well, there's, environmentalists love to talk about climate change these days. This is a big theme at the Wilderness Conference. And then, of course, you got terrorism and World War III and Ebola and all this kind of stuff. Well, all the more reason we need wilderness, all the more reason wilderness is valuable. And to see 1,000 people at a conference, another indoor venue, but it was beautiful just like here, they're experiencing the same wonderful weather we are. People who were really fired up about wilderness, even in the sense of conflict. And I just, this sense of wonder and adventure, it's just there for us through our understanding of wilderness across the whole system. And there was people, I don't know, from every wilderness or every state, but they were from all over the place. And that was very encouraging and very inspiring, even if a lot of the discussion was about the problems with the agencies, with funding and all that stuff. But, I just think that the thing that we have here in Idaho, particularly because our wilderness is so large, and I'm sure I just got in an hour ago, just got back. But I'm sure you've all heard about, how we're so thankful to Frank Church and what he's done because we have this giant wilderness. But wilderness will sustain here. It's big enough, it's going to sustain in a wild way in some fashion. But a couple of things came out, and this one is the flop. But my friend Terry Tempest Williams spoke at night, and the room, earlier in the day for the day things, the room was absolutely jammed. It was full when she spoke at night. And one of the things she did was she asked for people, the young people, to stand up. And maybe a third of the audience, a significant number of the audience, stood up. And I thought to do that here, but God, people would throw out their backs, I mean, and the kids all left. I've been told there was a bunch of kids here, but there were a bunch of kids here. But several hundred, yeah. We would have really noticed that, yeah, kids are here and they care and they're interested. But then afterwards, I talked to Terry, and she reminded me when she came to speak, when I asked her to come and speak at Idaho Conservation League, one of our conferences, Afterwards, she said, "Are you guys worried about how old the audience is getting?" And I said, "Yeah, we are worried." And this was like 10, 12, 15 years ago, before Craig and Rick and I were totally gray. This was back when we were still somewhat spry. But I said, yeah, we thought about it. We realized it was a problem. And I thought about it, and we talked about it, how we very intentionally got interns. We recruited young staff. We recruited young board members. And I wouldn't say that we have a huge demographic of young people, but it's significant. And we have dynamite young staff and younger staff, half our age. And they're getting older, we're all getting older, but I guess these were all high school kids. I wish I could go, you guys are the future, because that sense was real at this conference down there. And they were also a lot more colorful than our audiences, and that was cool too. They were from all over the place. And so, that was one thing that really stuck out. Then Saturday, I went into the Sandia Peaks, the Sandia Mountain Wilderness, and I climbed up to the Sandia Peak. And it's about 4,000 feet, 10 mile. The beginning of it, you walk along the bottom of, right next to where there's this giant development with these fancy, fancy big houses, big, beautiful houses. That's a little weird, but you're in amazing cactus, and there's still flowers, and there's fabulous birds, and you look up at the mountain, and that's the wilderness. Over here is the city. It's right up against the city. And then you walk through this crack in the mountain for several miles up switchbacks, and there's beautiful golden aspen, and there's amazing Douglas fir groves and scrub oak, and you can't see the city at all because you're in this crack. And then you get up on top, and you go a little ways along the ridge, and there's a tram, there's ski lifts, there's a bar with, fortunately, cold beer, and you have walked out of the wilderness after a pretty 6-hour hike, pretty strenuous hike. Get on the tram, it's 15 minutes back to the city. But the place was packed with people, and there were all kinds of folks, and there were all ages. There's lots of people carrying kids. And that's maybe as close as they'd ever been to see wilderness. Maybe they didn't even know they were looking at wilderness. But even that worked. When people are exposed to wilderness, it always works. In my experience, and I've been out with thousands of people, and I've taken out hundreds of people, it always works. So in this crazy time we all live in, wilderness is really, really important and really, really wonderful. The day I had hiking up out of the city, it was a 15-minute drive from downtown Albuquerque. It was different being in the wilderness than if we'd just gone for a hike. We went for a hike along the river as well. Being in the wilderness, we were out there in the wildest nature as possible, and that's, of course, what the wilderness is about. So I'm a half-full guy. The future is bright. We face all kinds of troubles, but the wilderness is more important than ever.
John, you're fun to follow. I'm going to be a totally different story. Thanks, Gary, for making this happen. It's great to be here. I'm not sure very many of you know much about the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church Foundation, so I'll just give you the total quick primer. We were founded in 2005. In 2010, we were asked to take on the stewardship management of the Frank Church. And so 4 years later, here we are with a lot of accomplishments under our belt, not the least of which is bringing young men and women to the wilderness to do stewardship. So what we do is connect citizens and communities to assist in the stewardship of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness and the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness and the surrounding wildlands. My take from being at the conference, it was powerful. There were a lot of mixed messages. There were indeed a lot of gray heads. But I am proud to say that four of the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church interns, our Wilderness Ranger interns, received scholarships to be there, which made us quite proud. What's the future of wilderness? It's stewardship. It's people. It's bringing a whole range of people to the stewardship and to the learning and to the connection with the land. And I did take that away from the 50th conference without question. There was a range of ages. You know, the young men and women that I talked with and spent time with were hopeful. They were bubbly. They were mostly worried about how they were going to get a job making things better in wilderness. And, you know, that is one of the things that the foundation has worked hard to do over the years, is develop professional wilderness potential staff and experts who will provide stewardship to the wilderness and provide on-the-ground experience that they can take regardless of where they end up working. But again, that is one of the biggest challenges and the biggest worries, not just for them, but for me and for the our organization as a whole. Where are these the best and the brightest going to go next? Seasonal positions are even hard to find with agencies. You know, one of the things this morning the chief talked about was the importance of creating not only a sense of ownership and leadership development in the next generations, but he also talked about the importance of partnerships. That's exactly what the foundation does, and that's what resonated with me. One of the big things that resonated with me is I connected with people I'd known for years and new faces that I met at the conference, without question. It's about the partnerships. It's about different ways to bring communities and create new communities for wilderness stewardship. Well, I loved Craig's comment about the process of wilderness designation being pretty much like a presidential campaign that never ends. Yeah, I would say the way that the foundation participates as a non-political advocacy organization, the way we participate is by bringing people to the wilderness and helping them understand why it is relevant now, why it will continue to be relevant, and why it is incumbent upon all of us to get on the ground and to encourage those we know to get on the ground and get some good work done. There's a conversion and a transformation process that occurs at any age. I'd also, you know, I mean, the opportunities are always the obstacles. I think one of the, you know, one of the pieces too that really jumped out at me was the buzz, the millennials. You know, what are they all about? What are they interested in? What are they doing? Well, I mean, you know, not surprisingly, they're kind of into themselves, and I think that. You know, one of the questions that John asked us was, do they desire the wilderness experience, or do they really just value open space to play with their gear? The millennials were a dynamic presence. They were super proud of their tech savviness. They really wore that like a badge of honor. And yet, they said, too, that they really want to make a difference. They want to be recognized as individuals, which is no surprise. I mean, everybody got awards at every soccer game they ever played, right, whether they won or not. So, I mean, that's a legitimate point that they're asking for. That's how we raised them. I think, though, that, you know, the other buzz was earbuds in the wilderness, handheld devices. You know, does that really goof up our wilderness experience? Does that goof up the intent of the Wilderness Act? I think that's really less of an issue, frankly. I think the real issue is that we have to get them out there. When you're giving someone a primitive tool to use, a crosscut handle to work, when you're asking them to shoulder their backpack and then showing them, making sure they know how to pitch their tent, they don't have room in their hands for anything. They don't have time to goof around with their earbuds. They are exactly what wilderness, it's wilderness, it's people providing stewardship, and it's really being in the moment. And so that I think was a pretty important takeaway piece for me. Wilderness, being in the moment, providing opportunities, not just for young men and women, but for everyone to be in that moment of wilderness.
I told John I'm really only good for one panel in the morning, so I'm not sure I have anything particularly productive to say in the afternoon. Yeah, I'll read through my notes again. I think that the future of wilderness, I guess I'm a little bit more worried about it than some other folks might be, in just the fact that there is so much demanding of our attention anymore. It's hard to take a deep breath and think about a slower pace. And it's hard to think about again, not expecting something tangible from a place versus just going and taking, getting your spirit enriched by it. One of the things I think, folks who care about wild places in Idaho need to think about is the importance of land and the respect for it without taking anything from it. We probably don't do a good enough job of that right now because, we talk about the economics, we talk about fish and wildlife habitat, and that's important to people. I've been encouraged that the idea of the state takeover, when they go have their little public hearings around the state, has been pretty roundly panned by people who show up. And I think that's good for our cause because that shows that when push comes to shove, people do care about public lands. They do care about what makes this state important. I think that people care about wildlife habitat. They care about that there's a place for animals to live. And, it goes back to the old saying about Alaska, you may never get there, but you're just glad that it's there because it has worth on its own, whether we physically get there or not. I think wilderness is going to have a lot of challenges in the future because there'll be more demands of it. And unfortunately, some of our traditional champions have kind of faded on us. I point to our Fish and Game Commission. I can remember a time when the Fish and Game Commission supported 2 million acres of additional wilderness in Idaho and told Congress that. And had a great map, had a great proposal forward. Now their comments focus solely on states' rights. And we don't want anybody telling us how to manage wildlife. We own it. We don't care if it's in wilderness or not. That's a big loss for us to have that professional group basically not particularly sticking up for habitat anymore, but parroting the line from the state legislature about states' rights. That's, I'm dealing with Idaho here. I don't know about Montana. I mean, kind of watch them from afar, and sometimes they're better, sometimes they're worse. But the Idaho one's pretty bad. I do think that that there's a way to get we are making progress and making places matter. Ralph mentioned today that he really hit the nail on the head when he said that when we talk about acres and big proposals, we don't get anywhere. When we talk about a place and get people to a place, then we start to win. That's a pretty proven formula. It's also very slow. We can only have the capacity to have a decent conversation, maybe a half a dozen areas at a time. And in the interim, you know what happens? Bad stuff happens to places. The other side of wilderness protection is not the trips to DC and talking to a lobbyist or talking to a congressional person. It's the mind-numbing slog through the planning processes that the federal agencies do. And every road to wilderness is generally paved at first by bugging the management agency to do a better job, basically trying to keep the playing field level. If we just had worked on the White Cloud legislative proposal, say for example, and not gone through 2 rounds of forest plans and 2 rounds of travel plans and 2 rounds of whatever, the White Clouds would not be recognizable today from what we expect. And that's kind of the unglamorous part of wilderness, and that needs more people too. One of the things that we're working on in the near term is BLM's doing a whole bunch of management plans at one time from basically the White Clouds east to Yellowstone. It was promising to hear Congressman Simpson mention Bora today, but that's not going to happen right away. But in the meantime, the wildness of Bora can be protected by coming forward and saying, let's manage our proposed wilderness as wilderness. Let's close some of the dirt bike trails here. Let's talk about connectivity between these big landscapes so that all of them thrive. That's not very glamorous, but it's very necessary to do. Again, these places, as they wait for their final solution, hopefully as wilderness, they don't protect themselves. They're at the mercy of Forest Service, the BLM, And they're kind of depending upon people here in this room and us to say, okay, until we get to the gold standard to designation of wilderness or national monument or whatever we come up with, we cannot take the chance of dropping our guard and just assuming things will be okay, because they're not. There's always going to be the motorized something that comes up. I have to tell a quick story. When they were redoing the Bruno Overlook, they're renovating that to do make it handicap accessible and put a bathroom out there and put some signs of interpretation of wilderness. So they did this dedication ceremony this summer, and a major general or some damn thing from the Air Force shows up, and he has a drone, and he wants to fly the drone up the Bruno Canyon to take some pictures for all of us. And thank God the BLM guy just like looked at him like he was nuts. But he did let him like launch it. It was very noisy. And the BLM fellow said, okay, put it down, we can't do that. I bring that up because you can buy a drone in Fred Meyer right now. We don't know what's going to come out next. There's a guy in Lewiston retrofitting motorcycles to go over snow. Constant monitoring of the places we love is important if we're going to see them protected permanently. If we just wait for the flashy stuff like, excuse me, like a monument proclamation or wilderness bill, those places won't be there by the time we feel we've got the political wherewithal to get them across the finish line. So the basic message is the future of wilderness means you engage on all fronts: planning, advocacy, getting people out there, talking to elected officials. We're in the business of pulling every lever we can think of because these places really deserve our best effort.
Greetings again. Couple quick thoughts about the future of wilderness, and it's really there's few things that I actually care more about, because it really touches on, for me, how I got into it and why it touches me. And earlier today when I got off the panel, somebody said, well, you were the youngest of the gray hairs. I still think of myself as one of the younger of the gray hairs, and sort of this sort of bridge, if you will, though the bridge is getting a little lopsided on one side for sure. But one of the things that was the really seminal lesson for me, and it was 30 years ago this year, was something I find staggering, but I found myself in Washington, D.C., as sometimes happens in this work, and I was walking around on the Hill, had a meeting with, I'll say who it was, with Mike Simpson's chief of staff at a bar, with Tim Mahoney, the fellow that Mike Simpson was describing today, who he gave an award to, and we were meeting at this place called the Tune Inn. And a famous bar on the Hill, and many, many legislative deals have been cut over the course of time in that once now no longer smoky environment. But anyway, my meeting ended because somebody had to go somewhere, and I was staying downtown, so I had a long distance to go, and I walked down to the Capitol, and I walked around the Capitol on the Senate side, and I stopped into this little Japanese garden that I used to spend time in, and there's a little fountain in there where you can leave your troubles behind right next to the Capitol because it obliterates the sound of the city. And it was while I was sitting there looking through the little screen that I realized that I'd been coming back to Washington, D.C. for 30 years. And as the youngest gray hair, that blew my mind, that I've been doing it for that long. And I was trying to think of why in God's name was I doing that? Aside from that, I couldn't find a better job. But it's because I've realized on that very first trip that one person makes a difference. I studied history in school, I studied political science, that's what my degrees are in, but it wasn't until I went to Washington, D.C. the first time that I actually engaged the process. And I was hauled around by people that became my mentors, people like Doug Scott, Tim Mahoney, many other people, Debbie Cease, that brought me around to meetings. In my very first trip, I was meeting chairmen of committees. I was meeting senior people in the administration. And I'm like, oh my God, you can do that? And I've been able to do it ever since. So the key thing is that one person makes a difference, and that will empower people forever. Democracy is bona fide screwed up right now. But you know what? It still beats the alternative. Policy goes in ebbs and flows. If we fight to take it back, we'll get it back. If we sit around and bemoan how everything is terrible, that's what it will be. So, again, I'm an optimist. And one of the sources of optimism comes from that lunch speech. First time I met Mike Simpson, I would not have predicted he would have given that lunch speech. First time I met Mike Simpson and we talked about this particular issue was up at Redfish Lake, and he talked about how, Rick, why would I do this? My idea of a wilderness experience is when my golf ball gets caught in the rough. He meant it, okay? Now, I've been to the Boulder White Clouds with Mike Simpson, sitting around that campfire he talks about. I've been with him where he's sitting down looking up at the stars that made him tear up today. The future of wilderness is our ability as citizens to create champions, our ability to take unformed, not just clay, but rock, and turn it into something that actually will influence public policy. I mean, really. Mike Simpson tearing up about wilderness, talking about it with pride, not as some, political thing that he's just, he got into this because of politics. He's going to end it because he loves the Boulder White Clouds, just like us. That's incredible. That will always create optimism with young people, that you can create champions where they weren't before. The other thing that will create optimism is I think one of the challenges of our movement is that we're really nice people engaging a very difficult process that has been for several years built around being extra nice. Having to build bridges, be pragmatic, be collaborative, be all this good stuff. And I'm a believer in it, truly. But sometimes you have to fight. And sometimes that's what young people care about. I got into it for the fight. I matured into somebody who compromises. But I got into it for the fight. And I'm pretty proud of some of those fights. Some of the biggest impacts that I've had, I can see because of timber sales, we stopped. Because of mines, we stopped. I have yet to see too many of the wildernesses we've created. But I believe we'll get there. A friend of mine from Oregon once said, "Environmentalists are hell to live with, but we make good ancestors." Every once in a while, it's the fight that brings people in, and I think that's also part of the future of this game. And not be afraid to do it. Idaho Conservation League is famous for our pragmatic, collaborative work, but be assured, we file more litigation today than we ever have in our history. We still fight. And finally, the reason I remain optimistic is for what wilderness does to you. A bunch of years ago, I was on a sabbatical. I did a 2-week hike across the Frank with 2 of my friends. Halfway through, I got food poisoning and spent 24 hours in the fetal position on my Thermarest. I felt bad. That night, a bear came through our camp. It's like, whoa. Got up, finished the hike, got flown out, all that other stuff, went home. When I went home, I realized I had a couple more days before my next little project. So I figured, God, I'm as strong as I'll ever be. As you can tell, I'm not exactly Mr. Workout or anything. So I just finished, I just hiked for 150 miles of the Frank. So I turned around and went back into the Frank by myself, without my 2 friends. And I hiked down Loon Creek. And somewhere down, about middle way down Loon Creek, I come to this place, and I've been watching salmon all day. That was the other part of this day. I'm watching Chinook salmon that have come all the way from the ocean. I sat in a hot spring, and for my first and only time, I caught a trout in a hot spring while watching a salmon. I'm thinking, that's pretty cool. Then I walked downstream some more, and I dropped my pack. I figure I'm going to wander down to this other place I'd been to years before where I wanted to fish. And I dropped the pack. I'm wearing my hiking shoes. I'm wearing a pair of Patagonia baggy shorts, and I've got my camera. And that's it. I don't have a shirt on. And I'm walking down, and Sarah, if you could raise your hand. I looked up at one point, and right where she is, there was a cougar sitting in the trail, staring me in the eye. Oh, that wasn't meant to do that. That was bad. But anyway, geez. I'm going to blush up here. But anyway, a mountain lion was staring at me in the trail. Now, as a wilderness advocate, you always want to see something like that. And you wanted to see it, and you want to absorb it. You want it to touch your bones as it does. And man, you get that thing, and it's going on, and you think about that. I don't even have a shirt on. You miss your pack, you miss your tent, you miss your car. So anyway, I'm looking at this cougar, and it's like, okay, cool. I've seen a cougar. I've seen my first cougar. That is awesome. Check it off the list. You can go now. And it didn't go away. It just sat there in the trail. And I could see a flick of its tail. It's like, mountain lions are big, man. They're big. And then I'm like, whoa. And so I step up, and there's a log on the ground, and I pick up a stick, and I smash it. I'm trying to make all this noise to make it run away. It did not run away. So I got down off the stick, and then I thought, if I'm going to be toasted, I want to at least get a picture. So I did. It's this crappy, grainy thing with my point and shoot. But I got a picture to make me myself know later in camp that this wasn't some strange, epiphany that I was having in my wilderness moment. But I stepped down, and I guess the other key thing, I had been at this a long time at that point. I'd been a wilderness advocate for a long time. I was burnt. I've been doing the White Clouds thing, for God's sakes, for a long time. I was burnt. I backed up, because you don't turn your back on a cougar. I backed up, and I dropped down, and I left this part where I could see the cougar anymore. And as soon as I popped back up, it was gone. I didn't know where it went. And I go, crap, I got to get back to camp, and I got to set up. I realized I'd already passed my pack. And I didn't have a tent. I had a little tarp. So I spent the night under the tarp, scared out of my friggin' brains, for no rational reason whatsoever. But I can tell you for sure, I felt wilderness, Idaho wild, whatever you want to say, to my core. And I haven't been burnt since. This is good, honest work. Whether you do it because you love it, because you do it for free, for whatever reason. I'm entirely optimistic that the future of the wilderness movement is bright, because wilderness is bright. Thanks.
Let me offer this. You can certainly come up and ask a question, or I know who's in this room, by and large. If somebody wants to come up and add to the conversation, if you be brief, don't tell an hour story, but let's just turn it into a big panel, if you see what I mean. You don't just have to ask them, but if somebody wants to come up and say, well, here's what I think we need to think about the future of wilderness, please do it. Nobody's at the mics at all right now, so we'll give it a little time. And we'll take it as long as it goes, but it doesn't have to be just a question and answer. Go ahead and make testimony or comment. Maria, go ahead.
Well, I don't have.
You on your tippy toes here?
Is this on? Can you tell? I have a question about advocacy and being a public bureaucrat myself. I'd be interested to know from folks outside the bureaucracy if they think or have experiences with people inside the bureaucracies who are advocates, and how that colors the picture or influences outcomes.
Just so everybody heard the question, because I don't know if you did. The question is, she works in a bureaucracy, and she wants to know from the panel what kind of experiences they've had with people in bureaucracy that are also passionate or advocates about a certain issue, and how does that all shake down?
I'll share a couple. There's actually two ways. You'd be surprised at how many unmarked brown envelopes I get with documents in it on a certain issue that they know I'm working on. Bighorn sheep recovery was a great one. There are lots of people in the Forest Service who wanted to see domestic sheep allotments closed, but we had to get them the political space to do so. To do that, we needed information of sightings, we needed information of grazing records, we needed all kinds of stuff that I didn't even know existed. So it was kind of handled two ways. One was the unmarked brown envelope that just shows up at our office. And the other thing are these very elaborate meetings in cafes where nobody else will see you talking to somebody from the agencies. Because it's very politically fraught to stand up. I know almost everybody I've worked with in the agencies has always been somewhat at risk to deal with the Wilderness Society on an issue, risk of their job. I don't know internally how that's discussed, but I've certainly seen a lot of very good, bureaucrats, if you will, I don't like to use that term, public employees, who want to see us succeed and who cheer us on, but are very limited about being able to do it publicly.
The other thing I'd add, the kind of advocates that I think of is Sam Hescock, the fire management officer. He's retired now, but he's one of the best fire advocates in wilderness, getting fire playing its natural role in wilderness. And he had to buck the agency just like I had to buck the agency when I was advocating for seeing fire really play its natural role. Or even another guy who last year helped us on he's the guy who laid out the trail. We didn't actually reroute, we just took the maze of trails going up to Bora and made it into a really good trail. He spent so much of his own time. He was out there 12 hours a day with us because he'd get there early, he'd go off, do his job, come back. And I just really value people like that who are passionate about the resource and passionate about the land. And I really honor those folks too. And Craig's right, we constantly get calls, I can't tell you who I am. Oh, I recognize your voice, dude. But, they give us great information that, we can't say where it comes from, but we can work it, so.
I would just add stewardship. You can feed your passion. Your passion to engage comes in, there's many ways you can do it. Helping rebuild trails with Sally's organization, anybody can do with no risk. And it will feed what might be missing by not being able to do advocacy otherwise.
Yes, sir.
I would like to pick up on an idea that Craig just put forward about this work being important not just when big flashy proposals come forward, but just on an ongoing basis. Two words that keep coming up, have come up throughout the day, and I hear more and more, and I hope they don't become buzzwords, are engagement and collaboration. If you're from Idaho, you should be proud of some of those collaborative efforts like the roadless rule effort that was spoken about, and what happened in the Oahe and Clearwater, and et cetera. In Blaine County, following the Beaver Creek fire, a committee formed as part of fire recovery, and it became known as the Afterburn Committee. It was sort of the Silver Jackets, which is the multi-agency group, then became Afterburn Committee, and now we have this thing called the 5B Coalition. And it's being facilitated by the National Forest Foundation. So I believe relationships are multi-directional. If people in a local community resent the Federal Lands Agency, that's their choice. But both sides have a responsibility to build that relationship. So the question and the challenge, I feel, one of the main ones is how do we build relationships? How do we build trust between local communities and the public lands agencies on an ongoing basis? I have found, just as I observe has happened with the local working groups on sage grouse, that people will stay engaged on an issue for an extended period of time if it's something that is really important to them. So I want to talk about and want to promote and want to hear discussion about how do we create these efforts, these local efforts. I mean, in Blaine County, it's a natural evolution out of a major fire, but in some communities, there's no structure there, but these relationships need to be strengthened, and collaborative effort needs to be promoted, and people have to have the opportunity to talk with one another on an ongoing basis.
Let me, real quickly, I'm going to say something, then I'll turn it over to them. There is an umbrella group in Idaho. They focus just on forests, but it's the Idaho Forest Restoration Partnership, and they've met at least 3 or 4 times now where they come together in these various collaboratives, and some of them are much further down the road than others, and they're doing partly just that, trying to build that skill base about obstacles and opportunities and how you get that done. Now, I don't think they initially want to get into range or you know, some other issues, but that is developing in Idaho, and it's pretty impressive. It's impressive enough that last year, I was fortunate enough to moderate it. All 4 congressionals came to it. Getting those 4 guys in the room to tell you what day it is pretty difficult, but they all came because this collaboration thing meant enough to them. They were doing other political things, but they came, is my point. And so there is stuff in Idaho where you've got a little of that learning going on, and they're trying to develop knowledge for people about how do you do this stuff, or what are the obstacles. Folks on the panel, anybody? John?
Yeah, when I was still working with Craig at the Wilderness Society, I worked on a lot of those forest groups, and I just think it's like, Larry, it's like you say, it's just like when you have a problem and you have a lot of different interests. I mean, we are now able to grab good scientists inside and outside the agency. In your case, I'm sure there was some really good fire guys who could talk about what it really does need to happen to restore the streams. You know, how do we invest in what it takes to deal with the recreation infrastructure and all those kinds of things? In what's so difficult, well, there's a number of things that make it really difficult. One is money. Having good moderators, being able to maybe get scientists to be able to be consultants. The other is just stamina. It just goes on, and do you ever really get there? And that was you know, I'm not doing it anymore, and I'm a happier guy. It was so struggle. It was such a struggle. It was just ongoing. But, you know, people in Idaho are practical. That's one of my great things I just constantly remind people. Most people are practical, and then there's people that you just have to work around, but that's always the story. And I think it was good to hear that you have overall good sense of what happened with the community coming together, with the agencies, with the experts to figure out what do we do from here, where we really care about our local landscape. And I think, you know, it's unlimited as to how you can apply that. And we need another round of success. We had great success with the Owyhee, and it's ongoing. It's not perfect, but it was tremendous success. And we need another round of success to keep it going. We thought the next one would come easier, that would come quicker. We thought we'd succeed in the Clearwater, which is a multifaceted thing. So I just think that I'm glad to hear you have positive things to say, because it's so hard, just the logistics of it. But people are practical and good-hearted and different, maybe. You learn from them. It's fun. It's interesting. And very difficult. Never gets easy. That's my take.
Pat, go ahead.
Yeah, Commissioner, one comment. Secretary Babbitt created resource advisory committees, and if you aren't participating in those, or the people in Blaine County aren't, you ought to check on that, because it brings purposefully together very diverse groups. And in Utah, where I'm from, they meet every month, and they have a really good conversation.
And we do, if I could, since you've said, we have a Forest Service RAC and we have a BLM RAC, and we do participate in those. And you know, like the RAC is geared around the funds that are available through, you know, SRS and those programs. The local working groups on sage grouse are geared around, you know, what are we going to do about the threat of listing of sage grouse? The 5B Coalition came out of the, you know, maybe we need these events. And, you know, in Custer County, they had the Herd Creek road closure issue that blew up. And, you know, maybe one way to think about this is when an event or an issue or a conflict arises, that's an opportunity for people to get organized around something to resolve those issues.
And I'm debating Ken Ivory next week in Utah on who should manage public lands, but one of the things I'm going to suggest to the 29 county commissioners who are going to be there is that they have on their webpage the degree of cooperation that they're getting from different federal agencies, so that the folks outside of that region can see whether there's real cooperation going on or not. Because sometimes the fight is actually on the other side and it gets portrayed the wrong way. John, the point I wanted to bring up is I was a legal advisor to the Metro Gang Unit in Salt Lake, and even though the image of Salt Lake is that we don't have a lot of gang problems, we really do. And whenever we arrested a juvenile, as we did one night, I would ride with them to the Decker Lake, which is the juvenile detention center, and have a conversation with them. And Salt Lake County is unique in that it's a very dense population-wise, fifth most dense in the country, slightly behind Chicago if you exclude the open space. So it also has 3 wilderness areas. No other urban county has that. So I said to this kid, Miguel, have you been up in the wilderness area? He goes, oh no, that'd be really scary. Now, here's a kid who had just been involved in a shooting, and he was saying that being in the wilderness area would be scary. The population, the demographics of America are changing. There are going to be a lot more people who aren't white, who have very different traditions. Hispanics, particularly a very strong family-oriented basis. African Americans have a great need for employment, for activities in the wilderness, and yet we don't seem, to me, as an advocate for wilderness and an advocate for conservation, to have been very successful in recruiting people who are not white, just to be blunt. So what's your suggestion on how we could get them more intrigued and involved in the Selway, for instance?
Well, interestingly, on the tram, there was lots of people of color. I thought that was really interesting. There was kids, there was high school kids. I also find a lot of interest among anyone. I think we have to be more direct, just the same sense that we had, that we got to create programs to bring interns in to get to know these young people. They have good educations. We need to find ways to be hanging out with them. I'm on the board with the Celery Boot Frank Church Foundation now that I'm no longer an advocate. And we talk about how do we get more people as interns? Is there ways to do programs where we have Spanish-speaking leaders? We got to work on it. We can't just think it's going to happen on its own. In the Southwest, it seemed to me that they were making very good connections with the tribes. I don't imagine it's, where it could be, should be, but I don't have an answer of this is happening, but there's a level of awareness that the demographic of America is changing. Not only the baby boomers moving out, that core sense of the environmental core from the 70s when everybody wanted to be a park ranger or wilderness ranger. The Selway Frank Foundation is finding the next set of wilderness rangers. We got to see that it really represents who's out there in America. And I'm back to my sense that it works. You take a kid out for the summer, they work hard, they learn, they have a sense of accomplishment. They come out a different person no matter what they end up doing in their life. And it's, a lot of us worked in fire or worked on trails when we were kids and went off to do other things, and it's stuck with us for the rest of our lives. And they're doing it, they're making efforts with the fire crews to see that they're more representative, because that's a big summer workforce. And it's just one of those things, we just got to keep having the dialogue. We got to keep having this is something, if we don't do it, a whole big segment of our population is going to miss out.
Yeah, but that's why we should demand that the CCC come back and be employed.
Absolutely, absolutely.
This side, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a comment and kind of a big question we've been asking is how do we bring young people, how do we bring other people that aren't white into this fold of wilderness? And just personally for myself, I don't know if you're familiar with William Cronin. He's an environmental historian and wrote this great article, The Trouble with Wilderness. And in it he kind of says, wilderness is great, but it's so hard to get to if you live in a city or you don't have a whole lot of money. Or if by chance you grow up in a place like Ohio, like me. My parents never took me out into the wilderness as a kid. I never had any exposure to it, but I love it today. And one of the reasons I think why that happened is because we live on the edge of town and there was a woods we could go and play in. And I developed this love of wild places, even though it was just a tiny little area. And so I guess my suggestion is, how do we get people engaged in wilderness? Well, I think you have to create tiny areas that are close. I'm not talking like city parks. I'm talking actual wild areas. I mean, this woods I grew up in hadn't been developed yet, you know? But if we set these things aside, you expose people to wild places at a younger age, and then they develop a love for them, and as they grow up and maybe get more money and exposure, they can go to these bigger places and maybe fight for them. And again, that's one of the main points in Cronin's article, is are we doing the wrong kind of wilderness here? Do we need wilderness in places like Ohio, Wisconsin, Mississippi? You know what I mean? Everything out there is so developed, people don't have exposure to it, and they don't know it, and they don't care about it. So, I don't know, what do you think, panel?
You know, Craig was so lucky to grow up in wonderful Idaho County, but he grew up on a ranch. Rick and I grew up in New York, and we had the experience you had. I don't know for sure that Rick did, but I'm pretty for sure he did. We found cool places. I also was lucky to get taken, when I was a kid, out to the national parks. But I think we need both. I mean, we need the big wild for the big adventure, the big opportunity. But we need all that, and it is slipping away. And yet, when people are exposed to, and you know, even if it's Central Park, it's different in Central Park than the rest of Manhattan. And you know, and these close by, like the place I was in, the Sandia Mountains, was fabulous. Golden Gate Park and Golden Gate National, I can't remember, National Recreation Area. It's not the city park, it's the outside. You know, those areas that are pretty close that you can get to are just as important. And I think, I don't know if I really made that point, but in this summer I went out, spent 2 weeks in the Frank, 2 different weeks, and I did this, you know, it's sort of the spectrum, the Sandia Mountain, the Frank. We got to have both. And then you're right, we need that too. And we just, you know, this whole thing, I'm very encouraged by this whole thing. We got to get kids outside. And one of the great lines from the conference, Sylvia Earle, the great oceanographer, and she's probably mid-70s, maybe late 70s. And her line, you know, great oceanographer, spent a lot of time in the water. Her line is, "No kid left dry." Every kid's got to get wet, you know? And that too, it's all that, you know? It's just, and we just got to do it, you know? And, you know, so you're here, you came from Ohio, cool. There's a spot for you here, you know, cool, glad you're here.
Yeah, I want to just refer back to the diversity question. I think that the agencies continue to struggle with diversity and how to encourage and bring in more diverse populations. My feeling in terms of bringing youth to wilderness is that it has to be deliberate. It has to be a program. It has to be defined, and then in terms of the foundation, for example, we need to be mindful about going after it. And I would say we are working on that. That's also a capacity issue, but John, you reminded me of a great experience I had. I was in Las Vegas for a conference a couple of years ago, and I went out to the Red Rock Wilderness area, which is a great, well-developed area with a beautiful visitor center, lots of parking, little picnic areas. And it was jaw-dropping. You know, there were families. They were out there doing hikes in their little rubber flip-flops and, you know, no sunscreen, no hats, and enjoying greatly. And it was a very, very diverse group. And would that not be the group to reach out to bring to the Frank, to bring to the Selway, to bring their young men and women into internship programs?
Something Sally just said, if I could just cut in for a second, sorry, John. The no sunscreen, no hat thing, you know, I don't have kids, so I'm the perfect person to talk about raising your children, but I think there's too many soccer games. There's too much time of every hour prescripted. I say this is a guy who runs an office full of parents. I listen to them organizing their schedules and organizing the game and who's picking up. Don't pick up anybody. Have the kid walk home. just, my grandparents used to throw me out of the house and I'd gripe and they'd lock the door. And lo and behold, I'd wander away and find something cool. And, we're losing our sense of exploration and our sense of independence because we're going to soccer games. But, like I said, I don't have kids.
The Boise kids are loaded with soccer players or off to state because they're the best team.
Whatever.
I think we have an environmental studies student who may also have some perspectives on the environment from a different point of view.
Yeah. My name is Richard Martinez. I'm a senior here. But yeah, just the greater conversation of, millennials and, it's a different time that we're dealing with wilderness. I grew up here in Idaho. My parents, we always went camping, and grew up here and run around in these hills. But I think that it's an interesting thing when talking about technology in the wilderness. When we think of the wilderness, it's like get away from it all, right? You're going away from the city and everything. But I almost think that it's almost better that if we were to incorporate the technology as we go out, instead of turning off everything that we have to share with those people. Because a lot of the people in the inner cities, they don't see that. They don't have Idaho like I had Idaho in my backyard. If I go to the Frank Church, which I've actually still haven't been to the Frank Church, been on the edges, but I haven't been to the Frank Church. But still, if we have that opportunity to be able to share it with people that don't have that in their backyard, that they're going to be like, well, you know what, if we don't have the money to do it today, if we're, they're underprivileged people, whatever it may be, they have those images that they can go to Google Earth and go zoom in and be like, whoa, look at all these pictures. It's something that they haven't seen, and that way that they can shoot for it in the future. Or if it is that a person from, on the East Coast sees those images, to be able to go and, just kind of, navigate through these, technologies that we have. If it is just, remote sensing images or GIS, whatever, you can go through and actually use that technology to get more people to come over here so that they can experience it and have that opportunity like we had the opportunity here in Idaho. And I think that, so not so much, taking out the earbuds or, turning off the technology. Maybe we should turn it on. And that way more people have a greater awareness of what we truly have here. And that's just something I wanted to comment.
There's a line somewhere for the intrusions of technology, but, Ansel Adams would carry these giant cameras out there and set up and take amazing pictures to wow the world. And that's one of the ways that we got the word out. And, people wrote books. Well, now they have Kindles. And so some people would carry notebooks, and now they carry Kindles. And, I just think, I think you got a really good point that the technology today is different, but it's still how you reach people. And you reach people with photography, and you reach people with books. And, this idea that they're fighting over whether you can bring movie cameras, video cameras into the wilderness, it just seems silly to me. And there could be a line if you're bringing in lights and you're bringing in lights, actions, cameras, and really commercializing it. But the idea of carrying small cameras, I think you're right. There was funny, though, as I was hiking up this trail, that here comes a woman on her phone talking away, jabbing, because, it's got good coverage all over the city, and she's jabbering away, and I'm just like going, be cool. Be cool. Don't worry. It's fine. It's going to be fine.
John has matured a lot. I think we just got to recognize that for a second here, because he would have ripped it out and smashed it to bits just a couple years ago.
It's okay. We have a question over here, or comment?
Yes, I usually voice my opinion with a checkbook. This time I'm going to give you some crackpot ideas. I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer, and there is a returning Peace Corps volunteer group here in town. And I wish there were more of the grassroots groups here, because I'm really speaking to them. Why not have a project with ethnic minorities through the Return Peace Corps volunteer group?
That'd be great.
We're here because we love the outdoors, and maybe I'll approach the group, since I'm a member, with this idea. There's also the AmeriCorps. I'm sure there are AmeriCorps people in Idaho and Boise who could do the same thing or something similar. What about the Boy Scouts? Why don't they have an outreach? What about that CCC and rejuvenation of it? Money is, of course, a problem. And I don't know, you folks sound rather burdened. I don't know how that you're going to stretch your time or your energy. to anything more, but this idea of the rejuvenation of the Conservation Corps is an excellent way for someone at the grassroots to get things moving. Let's see. Also, I'm a member of the Learning Lab. Why not with the Learning Lab do some special projects? I don't know if it would be an insurance matter that would prevent it, or if it's just sheer manpower and the lack of it. But there you have an ethnic minority that you could take out into the woods, and you wouldn't have to probably go too far because it's all new to them. Consider, for example, the African farmers who are at our Saturday markets. They'd be, and their children would be natural people who would support back to the earth movements. Well, I think that's about it. You get the idea. Thank you.
Just make a quick little plug for the Boise, the Foothills Learning Center in the foothills. It touches hundreds, thousands of elementary school kids, and we often do our board meetings there, and I'm just amazed by the stories I hear of all that goes on in that building. So there's some of this stuff going on. There certainly needs to be more, but.
The Forest Service and the Park Service both have well-funded Job Corps here in Idaho. So that's another one. And John, I don't know what possessed you. It's my friend Rick has apparently danced on your head in the wrong way, but you didn't have to retire to become an advocate.
I didn't have to retire?
To become an advocate. And in that spirit, I want to ask you what your experience, in any of the panel, what your experience was of advocacy by a young kid that you were working with and mentoring.
Now let me, Doug, are you after what I did with a young person to mentor them?
Yes, or your organization, but the younger the better.
What was the kid's name, Craig, the tall kid who went to work for Honda?
Oh, Chris.
Chris came to us. He was like a friend of Brad's. The classic case where you hire a young person, he brings his young friend in. Chris was this, like, I mean, he had the golden retriever personality. He was just a wonderful kid. And he was so eager. He just so wanted to help out. So we got him, we figured out a slot for him as an intern. We all worked with him to just talk up different stuff. We gave him some real crummy jobs nobody else wanted to do. We gave him some fun stuff. The next year, after he was no longer working for us, I'm hiking through the Gospel Hump. Dennis, still here, I hope. I'm hiking up along the ridge. We sat off to the side. We're going up towards Black Lookout, I think is what it's, the lookout that's open that has this fantastic, it's like 2-3 days in, fantastic view of the whole Salmon River. Me and Babette are sitting there, taking a break, and along comes these people, and I'm going, wow, what's the likelihood of anybody being here in the middle of the Gospel Hump? We never see anybody out here. I'm sitting there going, wow, here comes these people. Oh, I wonder who they are. Hey, John, how you doing? And it's Chris, he's on trail crew. And then this girl who's on the trail crew goes, John McCarthy, what are you doing here? It's Autumn Lear, went to school with my daughter in Moscow High School. And so, you know, every step of the way, my feeling with these young people is, Chris, this is so out of sight. You're doing trails in the summer, you're working with us in the winter, you stick with it. And it's just about, in the summer when I do these trail projects now with these young people, my job is just to say you're doing great. You're just so cool you can do this. And pick up that giant log that I don't want to pick up anymore. But I pull the saw with them, and you know, I can keep up in a saw, but I just feel like at this point, whether they're working with us as an intern or we're working with them on trails, my thing is just to be encouraging that you come out here and you plug into the wilderness, life's going to get better for you. Your life is going to be more complete. You're going to know more about yourself. You're going to know more about the world. Chris went off to work for Honda. He lived in Ontario, Oregon for a couple of years. Tough place to do it. He'd come and see us, and we'd pat him on the back. We'd tell him, you're doing great. Send him back to Eastern Oregon. Give him some beers. You know, and it's, he's still with Onda, I think. Maybe he's switched.
Yeah.
I think he's maybe in their Portland office or their Bend office. But he figured it out with, and all, I mean, you know, we tried to help when he had problems and he had questions, but the main thing is we just said, keep doing it, man. It's going to be fine. It's just like, you know, Rick doesn't know that is all you really do as a parent, is just try and encourage your kid. You don't have to give them awards. You don't always have to take them soccer practice, but you got to encourage them.
I guess I
learned a trick about donors when I managed a small community theater, and I would take the rich donors who loved it anyway and let them watch as some free program was put on in the afternoon for all the 5-year-olds. And the checkbooks and the stock certificates were signed, you know, right away. So for Rick and for Craig, get out there get a kid and give him an award, make it a hiking stick or something like that at your next donor thing. And since we're both going to be doing that together next month, there's going to be enforcement. And the final thing that I would say is just an inspiration while you were talking, John. I'm always trying to figure out the better way to make a communication to a member of Congress more effective. Pressed flowers.
Yeah.
On the letter. I found this, I pressed this flower for you on the edge, not inside, of the Frank Church Wilderness or the Boise Foothills.
Yeah, except for now, and when they get weird stuff mailed to them in Congress, they think it's like some kind of...
Oh, there's a way around that, John. Jeez. Haven't I given you this training? You befriend the most important person in your member of Congress's office, who is the local receptionist.
Yeah.
And you go in and you say, here is something that's important. It needs to go to Joe Smith in Washington. Would you fax it to Joe tomorrow? And by tomorrow morning, Joe gets to work, and there is a fax letter from somebody who says, this is the guy. Because the members of Congress and chiefs of staff, the political operatives, count on that receptionist to have their ear to the ground. What's on the minds of the folk?
I was going to share, I think, I want to share 3 quick stories about the younger people here. And I've been very lucky in the role I've had at the Wilderness Society that I've hired 3 really outstanding people. The first one was Betsy Buffington. I don't know if you guys know Betsy or not, but she was the daughter of Bob Buffington, who was the state director here for the BLM, who got canned by Jim Watt. And Betsy was working at Kinko's Copies when she showed up and applied for a job for me. And she didn't have any experience, but she kind of messed around the outdoor program here at BSU. And if you know Betsy, she's got a spark about her. And so I hired her, and she went on to work for the Sierra Club and the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, and then she came back to Wilderness Society. Now she works for one of the Conservation Lands Foundation or something. And she's made a difference in every campaign, every organization she's worked for. She's been a rising star. The second one was Lasha Johnston. And Lasha and her husband Nick got involved in the effort when the Air Force had plans for a huge bombing range out in the Oahes. And she and her husband showed up to these kind of loose-knit coalition meetings that we held at the office to try to figure out what we were doing. And this classic thing, she was a volunteer who just kept coming back and coming back and coming back. And she confessed a good deal later that she and Nick would go home and say, I don't know what those guys were talking about, but they kind of started making sense at some point. And then at some point I got some money and hired Lasha. And she went on to work in down the Sky Island Alliance, down in the Southwest, and has kind of run a couple of groups down there. And the last one, of course, has been Brad Brooks, who still works for me now. And Brad was interesting because he had just gotten out of school, and he had applied for a job with us. And he was framing houses in the winter. And it was come time that he was the finalist. And I talked to one of his advisors, one of his references, who said that, asked if Brad had told me that he was the wild duck call champion for the state of Idaho. And God, no, I didn't know that. So I called Brad on his cell phone. He was out, framing a house, and I could hear the hammering in the background. And I told him who I was, and he kind of got all excited. And I said, call him back. I said, well, Brad, it's down between you and another fellow who's the the wild goose calling champion. So I need to hear what you got before I can make a decision here. And he kind of took me, he thought I was telling the truth for a minute. And then he kind of laughed and said, well, Craig, I really can't do that right here. So I said, oh, that's okay, I'm just messing with you. And then I offered him the job. And Brad, as folks who know him here know that he's a stellar person. So I guess getting back to young people and mentoring, I've had the luck to work with 3 young people who have stuck with the conservation movement. I'm very proud of that.
Well, before we thank the panel, let me just close with one of these weird stories that brings all this kind of together. There was a guy who worked on a CCC trail here in the 30s that Doug Brinkley talked about last night. He went back to New Jersey, and he must have told his son something about the mountains out here, because his son went on to get a PhD, but he was interested in international relations, and that son was Greg Raymond, who's, if you've come to other Frank Church conferences, Greg has been the Frank Church chair here for the last 10 years, world-known scholar in foreign policy. He's now phased retirement, but you never know how a little experience like that ripples out in funny ways forever, I guess. And of course, now he would never live anywhere else but Idaho. So join me in thanking the panel, and many of you, I think, in an hour will be up there somewhere.